Mike Ehrmantraut has a code, a moral code. It may not be the code that you and I choose for our lives, but it's one that he has carefully considered and he is fully comfortable with. As we know from one of the greatest TV shows of all time, The Wire, a man must have a code.
I mean, don't get it twisted. I do some dirt too, but I ain't never put my gun on nobody who wasn't in the game.
A man must have a code.
This code sets him apart from every other criminal in Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, to the point where many, but definitely not all, audience members are sympathetic to his point of view, even if they realize he's engaged in violent and criminal acts. So how did he become this hardened criminal that we see as Gus Fring's right-hand man in Breaking Bad? How did he develop this code of ethics that sets him apart from every other criminal? Well, the 6th episode of the first season of Better Call Saul, titled 5-0, helps us answer that. But let's back up a second and set the scene. When we first meet Mike in Breaking Bad, he arrives at Jesse's apartment after Jane overdoses and ends up dying, with, of course, no help from Walter White. By the way, if you didn't know, this was originally written to have Saul Goodman perform the cleanup duties, but Bob Odenkirk was busy, so they created a new character to become a fixer that ultimately became Mike.
Saul Goodman sent me.
What's interesting in that scene where we first meet Mike is he is all business and he is strictly sticking to his job. That ethos follows him throughout all of Breaking Bad, where we see Mike knowing that he has a job to do and he just wants to perform that job. Throughout Breaking Bad, there's really not a whole lot that we find out about Mike in his personal life. Yes, we know he has a granddaughter that he wants to take care of, but with the luxury of a prequel, the writers wisely decided to shed some light on the core of Mike's life story and what led him to his life of crime and eventually led him to his demise. The episode starts off with Mike coming to Albuquerque by train, where we see that he's bleeding and he has to shore up his bandages. After getting cleaned up in the bathroom, he visits Stacy, his daughter-in-law, as well as his granddaughter Kaylee, who is played by 3 different girls throughout the show. Mike says that he wants to be here for Stacy, for Kaylee, and that he's going to be in the ABQ for good. But Stacy is concerned, says that Maddie, her husband, and Mike's son was different before he died. He wasn't himself. She's really nervous about this. She says that she heard a phone call in the middle of the night that she assumes was with Mike, but Mike lies to her, adamantly denies that it was him, and she eventually lets up on her questioning.
I guess that's that.
Mike calls a cab, where he's eventually taken to the vet, who we meet for the first time. After getting stitched up, the vet lets Mike know that he's got work if he's interested, but Mike turns him down, although we know that Mike is later going to take him up on that offer. But the crux of this episode comes in the form of a flashback to the events that occurred just a few months ago in Philadelphia. And in these events and throughout this episode, we see the core tenets of Mike's moral code, which will play out throughout the rest of Better Call Saul and Breaking Bad. Mike knows that Maddie's former partners, and again, Maddie's his deceased son, so Maddie's former partners, Hoffman and Fensky, they were the ones responsible for Maddie's death. They were crooked cops, just like Mike was, but they were concerned that Maddie was not as on board with their misdeeds, and so they decided they had to kill Maddie to protect themselves. But they did not cover their tracks well enough, and Mike knows that they are the killers. So Mike pretends to be drunk in a bar. He comes up to Hoffman and Fensky and says,
I know it was you.
He then continues his drunk impression by walking home, where Hoffman and Fensky come to pick him up and drive him home. They confront him about what he said at the bar, and Mike proceeds to tell them that he knows they killed Maddie. They know they staged the murder. The cops, still thinking that Mike is drunk, take him to a back alley where they intend to kill him. But Mike has outsmarted them by planting a gun in their car, which he uses to then kill both of them. And then the very next day, he moves to Albuquerque. But the story of what happened to Mike isn't the most interesting thing about this episode. What's most interesting is that from this event, we get the blueprint of Mike's moral code, what he learned from this tragic event, and what he did not learn. What's most notable from these events to me is that Mike knows that crime does not pay, yet he doesn't learn from it. Because of his crooked actions as a cop himself, as well as him trying to get his son to participate in them, at least to protect Maddie at the time, because of all of that, his son is dead. His son's partners, Hoffman and Fensky, they are dead. The whole precinct is completely dirty. There are no winners in this situation at all. So you would think that Mike would have taken this opportunity to turn himself around. And he does, at least for a time. He could have worked in that toll booth for the rest of his life, and he could have helped out Stacy and Kaylee. Now, is that as lucrative a job as stealing quote-unquote easy money or working for criminals? No, I guess it's not as easy as that money supposedly is. But as Mike noted, as a cop, you could, quote,
You bust a drug dealer that has more cash than you'll ever earn in a lifetime.
So what's the harm in joining this criminal enterprise if you're going to be able to get more money, in Mike's mind? Compounding this problem for Mike is that he feels tremendous guilt, as he should, over the death of his son, and his son, since he's dead, can't take care of his wife, Stacy. So now Mike feels this obligation to take care of Stacy and Kaylee, which leads him not just going back to Albuquerque and supporting them there, but it leads to him seeking out again this allegedly easy money, even after everything that he's gone through in Philadelphia and all the tragedy that it's taken place on every single life involved. Also, what I realized by watching this episode is that just like Jimmy has been poorly influenced by those around him, Mike is also poorly influenced by being around Jimmy. These two would have been far better off if they just yelled at each other about parking validation tickets. But instead, they form a connection, they get to know each other on a more personal level, and they realize they have something in common. They are both prone to cutting corners and entering shaky ethical grounds, and their influence on each other feeds these bad decisions that they both make. In this episode, Mike gets Jimmy to spill coffee on one of the Philly detectives so that Mike can steal his notebook and see what that detective has on Mike. And in a previous episode, as we've talked about before on this channel, we see Jimmy talk Mike into helping him plot against the Kettlemans. So it's interesting to note how each of them made each other worse by their relationship. And this episode also tells us the main tenets of Mike's moral code. In particular, I see three key principles. The first one is that the ends justify the means. This is the most important part of Mike's moral code, in my opinion. This is also a long-standing philosophical debate using fancy terms called consequentialism versus deontology. Is it okay to ever lie, to steal, to murder? To a deontologist, it is never okay to do those things. Those things are inherently wrong and you should always avoid them. You should seek out other ways to achieve whatever you are trying to do, but you can't do it in a way that involves immoral acts. That's deontology. That's the ends do not justify the means. Mike disagrees. Mike is what's known as a consequentialist. A consequentialist will not ask, is this act immoral? Instead, they will ask, does the end result of this action result in a good or a bad outcome? From this episode, is it okay for Mike to murder the two police officers who killed his sons? If you think murder is never acceptable, then the answer to that question is always no. You should turn those cops in and face the judgment of, yourself owning up to your corrupt acts, as well as Hoffman and Fensky getting their day in court. That's what a deontologist would do. But to Mike, these were crooked cops who were murderers in their own right. So yes, in his mind, it's justifiable to murder them. In Mike's worldview, if you have to do something like stealing, lying, or killing, as long as you are doing it for a good reason, then you can justify it in your own mind, and you are justified in that act. The end result justifies whatever means you have to follow to get there. Whether you agree with this or not, Mike clearly had this as the core tenet of his moral code that we see in Better Call Saul and in Breaking Bad. The second key tenet of Mike's moral code is that protecting and providing for your family comes first. We saw this in how he tried to protect Maddie, even though it didn't turn out the way he wanted it to. And we see it throughout both shows how desperately he tries to provide for Stacy and Kaylee. As Mike says in a different episode, quote,
But I do what I do so they can have a better life.
So in Mike's moral code, you do whatever you have to do to provide for your family and the ones that you care about, even at the risk of your own peril. And of course, Walter White had this very much in common with him throughout most of Breaking Bad, although I think it's pretty obvious that Walt's family was not the main reason why he continued to do all of his illegal acts.
I did it for me. I liked it.
The third key tenet of Mike's moral code is that you try to protect the innocent as best you can, and you only use those that are quote-unquote in the game. He asks Jimmy for help spilling the coffee on those Philly detectives because he knows Jimmy is already dirty. He doesn't ask Stacy to lie to the cops when he confesses to her, and he tells her to do what she wants because she's not in the game. So Jimmy's in the game because he's already done some illegal things with Mike in terms of the Kettlemans, but Stacy is not in the game, so he gives her an out and says, you do whatever you want. He does not want to push this on her. And so this is why Mike gets so upset on the various times that innocent people get killed in Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. They did not sign up for this, and he did. The other people in the game did sign up for this. One prominent example is when Gus is using Nacho and Gus threatens his father. Mike tells Gus, quote,
You have a gun to his father's head. That doesn't sit with me.
So sure, Gus does not always listen to Mike, but Mike makes his code of protecting people who did not sign up for this life very clear, and we see the beginning of this code in this episode. So throughout 5-0, Season 1, Episode 6, we see the root causes of what motivates Mike, and we see what leads to his depraved moral outlook. Throughout the rest of the series, we also see what becomes of Mike as a direct result of him following this moral code, and obviously it doesn't go in the direction that he wants. However, as he says to Jimmy in a later season, quote, we all make our choices, and those choices, they put us on a road. Sometimes those choices seem small, but they put you on a road. You think about getting off, but eventually you're back on it. Mike could never get off this road that he chose for himself, and it led him to a life of working with and protecting drug dealers, committing murder, and ultimately led to his futile death. A death which did not need to happen, where he likely realized that his ultimate goal of providing for Stacy and Kaylee would come up short, and that in the end, his moral code was futile. It was all for nothing. I hope you enjoyed this video. I will be back next time to talk about Jimmy and Chuck's relationship, how promising it was in Season 1, and what could have been. I'll see you next time. Bye.